Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Happy New Year, everyone. Rosh Hashanah started a few nights ago, heralding the new year on the Jewish calendar. I haven't really thought about any resolutions. I'm currently still trying to fit my pandemic life back into my pre-pandemic life, and all the work and travel I used to do that I now have to get back to. I mentioned it somewhere recently. There are a whole bunch of like routines and bits of life I've picked up these past 2.5 years that, well, they're not exactly sustainable when fall trade show season hits, and having to reconcile myself to that's been kind of jarring. Plus the pre-pandemic Gil wasn't over 50 and hadn't gotten the best bad news, as I call my surprise CLL diagnosis. So there are a lot of shards and fragments that I got to glue together to put together some semblance of a public-facing me. But something kind of neat happened last week, and I want to tell you about that before we get to the show. I talked about it in one of my postcard a day videos, but I've been thinking about it more since then. I did a bunch of travel in the last 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago was a client visit out in Michigan. Last week was a trade show in Philadelphia where I had to speak and moderate. And then, then I went to the annual trade show of my former trade magazine, Contract Pharma, on Thursday. And I was wrapping up a conversation with one of the affiliate members of my trade association. We were in the reception area outside the exhibit hall when this guy nearby took his phone out of his pocket, which caused a bunch of business cards to fall to the floor. I went over to him to help retrieve them, and then I went back to my member. And when both of our conversations finished, the guy came over to me, and he pointed at my name badge and said, "Excuse me, Gil Roth?" And then he said, 10 years ago, when you were still at Contract Pharma, I got fired and I was looking for a job. And I asked you if you could give me a complimentary pass to attend this trade show. And you did. And I wound up getting hired by one of the companies I met while I was here. And I've always wanted to thank you in person for helping me, because it changed my life. And even in my burned out state with this travel and my trade show planning for a couple of weeks from now and all the other stuff going through my head, I started to get kind of choked up over the notion that something I did mattered that much in someone else's life. Lucky for me, I noticed from his name badge that he was at a company that I've been trying to bring aboard my association. So I hurriedly pitched him on membership so he wouldn't figure out just how close I was to crying in front of him. But I think he knew. But it was this really beautiful moment that he went out of his way to thank me for helping him, and that he remembered me from a decade earlier, and that he let me know what it meant. Anyway, that's what I talked about the next morning on my little postcard video. But later in the day, I got to wondering, or building a story, I guess, or speculating. See, he saw my name badge, always wanted to thank me, and he did. But I wondered what would have happened if the best bad news last year turned out not to have been as good. Like, what if I was dead by now? And I like to think my old magazine would have run an obit for me, and they would have had some sort of tribute because, I helped launch the magazine, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. But what if they did that, and what if he saw it? And what if he thought, I always meant to thank that guy and I never got the chance? And would he have regretted not dropping me a line or an email just to say, hey, thanks for helping me out all those years ago? Or would it just be like a momentary thing that, you know, gave him a little pang of regret, but disappeared? Or would it have changed his life again and made him, you know, more aware of how quickly things turn and how we need to tell people things sooner rather than later? Anyway, that evening, I came across a news piece about the new scholarship, the Center for Cartoon Studies, in honor of the great cartoonist and artist Ed Koren, who I recorded with in 2016. And the piece mentioned Ed's, quote-unquote, incontrovertible cancer, which he had told me about in an email right after my big disclosure about my CLL diagnosis in July of 21. So I called Ed that night so we could figure out a time to really talk over the weekend. And I also wanted to find out if his lung cancer had robbed his speech or if he was still, you know, able to talk. He was. And we got to schmooze on Sunday night. He is the king of the schmooze, as he has told me, and he always regarded me as a worthy successor. But after that conversation, I'm really thinking of how I can fit the 5-hour drive up to his place in Vermont in the next week or so, just to see him one more time and get to see his studio and thank him for the 60 plus years of New Yorker cartoons and covers and all the other art he's done, and otherwise just, you know, give some respect to an artist before he's gone, and, you know, maybe have one more schmooze. I mean, I've got so much going on right now, and I literally, when I was talking to him, said, hey, maybe sometime this fall, and he was like, well, I hope I'm around for it. So, you know, just like the guy at the conference, you know, all that stuff pales, and now I'm trying to figure out the logistics of getting that 10-hour round trip in for what'll probably be an hour or less of conversation. Anyway, I am prattling yet again. If I've got a point, it's a really obvious one. Don't let the moment slip away. Tell people the things that matter. Anyway, let's get to this week's show. Speaking of things that matter, my guest is George Prochnik, who was on 2 previous times to talk about his books on Stefan Zweig and Gershom Scholem. Both of those were in person at his home in Brooklyn, but he and his wife, Rebecca Mead, and their son moved to London, so we went remote this time. And George has a brand new memoir out, sort of about the move, but really about so much more. It's called I Dream with Open Eyes, a memoir about reimagining home. It's from Counterpoint Press. It's out this week. Now, as I mentioned, George is married to New Yorker writer Rebecca Mead, who wrote her own memoir about their move, Homeland, which came out earlier this year. We recorded a podcast about that this spring. You might want to go check that one out, too. They're just like the 2 books, they're very different approaches to what this move was and what it meant to each of them. With I Dream with Open Eyes, George wrestles with his family's histories. On one side, they trace back to the Mayflower. On the other, Jewish immigrants from Vienna. And they're sort of intertwined by Freud in interesting ways. And George uses Freud's exploration of civilization and its discontents, as well as Freud's dream work, to try to grok something about the world we're living in, and why the 2016 election was enough to start that decision to leave America. And George and I, well, we talk about exile and its ongoing thread in his life, but what this book does, it's a very beautiful and deep and thoughtful examination of America and what it's meant to different generations and people. But it's also about what stretches beyond the national, beyond borders, and how throughout the 20th century and today our unconscious is forced to reckon with a really grotesque world, and how that process is shaped and been shaped by politics and art and technology, And he shifts over the course of the book, covering Freud and Breton and the poet H.D. and paintings by Titian. And he's got all these different ways of exploring the real and the unreal of our age and what it meant to make a real decision to go into a sort of exile. And I talk about it during the conversation, but I was also struck by how well George fuses personal history into his larger themes, the family history, and the overall narrative of the book. It's never too much, but enough to let us know about both the unique and the universal aspects of his experience and that of his family. And he gets into the notion of working life and job/career. And how you balance that with making art, with the books that he's written. And you guys know that is absolute catnip for me, so I really grooved on that stuff. But I think I Dream with Open Eyes isn't just a compliment to Rebecca's Homeland memoir, but also to the two previous books I talked with George about, his biographies of Zweig and Scholem, each of whom preemptively chose exile in recognition of the rise of Nazism. And the notion of George's own exile balanced with his wife's sense of return, her being British and leaving America meaning something very different to her, creates this really fascinating tension across George's whole body of work. It's part of why I love having repeat guests on the show where threads like this become more apparent or more significant. Anyway, I really enjoyed I Dream with Open Eyes, and I think it's an awfully good memoir about what it meant to live in America and to decide to leave America during the Trump administration, even when it's about so much more than that. Here's George's bio from the new book, and we'll get to the conversation after this. George Prochnik was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in General Nonfiction in 2021. He is the author of 5 books of nonfiction, including Stranger in a Strange Land, which was a New York Times Editor's Choice and was shortlisted for the 2018 Wingate Literary Prize in the UK. His previous book, The Impossible Exile, was shortlisted for the 2016 Wingate Literary Prize and won the National Jewish Book Award for biography, autobiography, and memoir. He is also the author of In Pursuit of Silence, Putnam Camp, and Heinrich Heine, Writing the Revolution. He has written for The New Yorker, The New York Times, Book Forum, and LA Review of Books, and is editor-at-large for Cabinet Magazine. Born in Grand Junction, Colorado, he currently lives in London with his wife and their son. And now, the 2022 Virtual Memories conversation with George Prochnik. Tell me about the origins of the book. Tell me what led you to pursue a sort of memoir about the experience of the last few years and everything else that we'll talk about all the different threads that go into this book, but where did it begin for you?
Sure. Well, I guess that the book really grew out of an effort to understand both our own response to the election of 2016 and a larger matrix of concerns that we had about our life in the United States and the direction that the country was going, which had preceded that event and which were not assuaged by the results of the election. On the one hand, my wife Rebecca and I had been thinking about taking a break, at least from New York, for a while. But there was a way in which the drama of that vote for Trump shook us into thinking about the prospect more substantively. I still felt that there were aspects of what we were doing that we didn't understand at the time that we were doing them. And by that, I mean, we never thought that the meaning of the election was such that it was going to put us in our privileged life at any kind of immediate risk of some sort of heinous oppression. We knew that we were not the immediate targets of the administration, but we felt that there was a need to respond beyond the collective protests, etc., that we certainly took part in, and beyond my own efforts to talk at a few political events hosted by progressive organizations, and to write the little things that I'd written. I wanted to make some kind of gesture of repudiation, even if it was symbolic. And the gradual understanding that our move had a performative layer to it, that it was an effort to say, this is impossible to bear and continue in the manner that we had been, only became clear to me sometime after we actually made the move, and became really the genesis of the book. I write at one point that Karl Marx's famous dictum about, paraphrasing crudely, that up until now, philosophers have only interpreted the world. We need now to change it. I thought to myself that we had changed our reality by the time that we moved to London, but now we needed to interpret it. We needed to understand what we did and whether it might have some larger resonance for other people. So the fact that there was this symbolic dimension meant to me that it could only have any weight, any gravity, if I did write something that hopefully other people might find points of parallel or provocative aspects in the text that would trigger their own decisions about how to respond to the turmoil of recent years. And I want to stress that I think that the book is an effort to provoke a conversation, and it in that sense, it's different than other things that I've written in the past. It's directly tackling this moment, but because of my own background being so steeped in trying to understand mid-20th century European politics, I could never escape from that field of resonance when I was trying to engage with and analyze what had occurred in the United States in my own era.
How tough was it for you to make that sort of change? I mean, we spoke in the past on two of your previous books, on Scholem and on Zweig, both of whom figure into what this book is. But how tough was it for you to write and try and understand things in the present moment, and ones that were personally resonant for you?
I saw it as imperative. I've never written as from an Archimedean vantage point. With my book on Zweig, I was also trying to reflect on my father's family's experience as refugees, Holocaust refugees escaping Austria. And in the Scholem book, I was trying to think about what captivated me in Jerusalem and in Jewish experience in the years that I was especially engaged with it. So I've been used to trying to take these texts, which I have brooded over and reread as active guides or inspirations or counterpoints to decisions that were urgent for me in my own life. So in some sense, because I do think that the Trump presidency, to use a phrase I don't especially like, ticked all the boxes for a kind of fascist event, I was exactly the wrong person for it to happen to, without having any way of not bringing to bear all of the reading I'd done on the different ways that this phenomenon manifests itself historically. And I think that's another point that's maybe jumping ahead a little bit. But one conclusion that I come to in the course of the book is that there's been a lot of debate among serious historians about how much to, I don't know whether the word is credit or charge or freight the Trump presidency with charges of fascist elements. And I came to think that these finer questions of how specifically it accords with the historical definition as that came out of Italy early in the 20th century were maybe beside the point. That whatever it is that he represented and the energies that he galvanized, however exactly they fit into the equation of what makes for textbook definition fascism, it was in that family of political movements, and it needed to be addressed. Most importantly, it needed to be countered as if it were that thing. Our responsibility when we confront some kind of massive systemic injustice and threat, at a certain point, it ceases to be about the specifics of definition and becomes a call to action that we have to heed.
Which is probably why it's a good thing you're not very active on Twitter, where everything gets picked apart and nickel and dimed with the technically it's not fascism because X, Y, or Z, when in fact, the boot is coming down.
Exactly.
Yeah. What did it teach you about America, both the election and the experience of leaving? Which I know is an insanely broad question. I'll have narrower focused ones as we talk further.
It's a good question. I mean, one thing that I write about is one conversation occurs to me that I had with my childhood friend, a painter named Adam Sivanovich, in which I found myself speaking without realizing it. This was prior to Trump's election, in praise of something like an American exceptionalism. And I say that in a guarded way. I didn't embrace any kind of American manifest destiny, to put it mildly. But I did believe in some fundamental goodness historically triumphing at home. Obviously, if we look at America's influence in the world at large, it's impossible to sustain that vision. But I held to something, and I think I held to it in part, as I explore in the book, because of my mother's history in the country. She comes from a family with deep ancestral ties to New England. She has ancestors who were on the Mayflower, and she and her family, larger family that I knew, really represented a New England tradition in which Emerson and his cohort figured highly, and which I think still carries ideals that are profound and have a distinctive American idiom. One person who I quote in an epigraph to the book is Stanley Cavell, the philosopher who passed away recently. And his understanding of Emerson was something that I felt I saw lived out in my mother and some of her family. That ideal of an embracing, inclusive hope for the transformative prospects of national identity was something that I held into my adult life, and probably even up to the eve of the election. I didn't think that America would go all the way over to the other side. And the fact that the Trump presidency happened, even if he was then, as he was, voted out of office, it was too big a shock to my idealism. Something broke. And I'm not sure that that's altogether a negative thing. I don't think any form of exceptionalist understanding of one's national identity is good. but there's some sadness there. Um, I think that since I left, which was in the summer of 2018, so just over 4 years ago, I've been able to look at the country with a bit more distance again, and to remember and re-engage with so much about America that I love, and that I know is still there. You know, it's the warmth and openness of so many people, whatever their political beliefs, the sheer physical magnificence of the country, and its hopefulness, despite everything. The way that things have a sense of fluidity and possibility that in Europe is harder to find.
Especially the very, very present moment. Sure.
Yeah.
So is exile really your bag?
Well, I think that
between the subjects of who you write about and this experience,
I think it's something that's been with me since childhood through my father's experience and his parents' experience, and something that I have felt enormously concerned with when I've seen America's response to refugees or would-be asylum seekers, etc. It's a problem globally, what we do with the massive displacement of people through conflict and climate change and all sorts of economic impossibilities. So I am concerned with it because if the subtitle of my book is a memoir about reimagining home, I think that although few of us are fortunate to enjoy a home that we feel truly secure in, there is some abiding aspiration to the embracing peace and belonging, sense of peace and belonging that attaches to the idea of home, that it's impossible for us to entirely give up. That said, I think that my own understanding at this point tends to be of the impossibility of home and what it means to reconcile oneself to that, which is a semi-exilic state of mind. And again, maybe not the worst thing, given how much of the world's population today is forced into that category of disinheritance, displacement, dislocation that I have found myself occupying more volitionally than lots of people.
You know, it's, I'll say, as someone who doesn't have kids, one of the things that's interesting to me about it is your volition, but there's family involved. That sense of, you know, you're making a decision, and as you bring up your son's reaction to it and how up for it he was, there's still that sense of, you know, the greater responsibility of, you know, this exile might be important for me, but there are other larger factors I have to take into account.
That's certainly true. And I think that what it meant when I could no longer believe that the progressive little world I lived in Brooklyn was necessarily the best environment for Rebecca's and my son to grow up in was another shock point that helped to mobilize this experience and the decisions that both went into it and have continued to play into our thinking about the future. Even in the ways that the environment that we lived in before leaving was sheltered, there was something I became more and more uncomfortable with over time. And despite all the complexities of the decision as it's played out and the ghastliness of so much of the political world over here, I don't think it was wrong to have our son experience more than one environment as home, more than one world as home, because it's been enlarging even when difficult. And the securities that we had and the sort of routines that we had felt stale and difficult to grow in by the end.
Now, I recorded with your wife, Rebecca Mead, a few months ago about her book, Homeland, which, well, my question is, do you think your book serves as, I would say, not a prequel exactly, but a more theoretical flip side of the coin to her book on this, or just a different set of perspectives on what that same choice and same decision meant from the other person in the marriage?
I think both of the initial ways you framed it are correct. And actually, the book was written first, although Rebecca didn't read it. So it was, in a sense, a pre-understanding. And her book is so much more concerned with also setting up life here in England. Which
I want to say the practicalities, but her book's deeper than that. But it is more the physical aspects.
The enactment. Yeah, that's right. I think definitely my book is more theoretical and more obsessed with interpreting our experience rather than tracking it in its literal manifestation. But I think another way to situate the two of them is that my book is much, much more about what it means or meant to leave America after having lived there most of my adult life and having a family with such a complex and long history in the country. And hers is more about this very complex understanding of home after you've been away from a place for a long time and return. There's not.
I was going to say yours is exile, hers is return in some
right.
ways.
I think that's right.
And again, they go together beautifully. So, I'm glad to have both of you on the show. Not together, which could, lead to all sorts of strife, go the way my conversations tend to go. But I'm glad we're talking about it like this. But how the book, I want to say, how did it come together for you? I mean, in terms of the shape and the major threads that you're running through it, both your experience, this sort of the family histories from, as you mentioned, the two sides of your lineage, and then the Freud, Titian, the various other, we'll again say theoretical or less immediate connections to your story itself. What was that process like, I suppose, in terms of writing it and threading all of this together?
Well, it's a bit of a intellectual Coney Island kind of experience. I mean, I do in some way think of it as a roller coaster or funhouse ride through a number of thinkers and themes that I'd been concerned with for years, but never so explicitly in terms of a decision that was still unfolding in my own life. So to pick out one part of that question, I wrote a book about Sigmund Freud's relationship to my great-grandfather, who was involved with both Freud personally, he was a friend, and also helped legitimize his ideas in the New England medical psychological, neurological community that he was part of. I wrote about him in 2005, I guess I was writing that book. And there were different ways in which what I brought out about the argument and points of affinity between Freud and my great-grandfather, James Jackson Putnam, those ideas seemed relevant to me again and in a new light, in light of what had happened in America over the ensuing years. And I felt that there was an obligation to revisit some of what I'd written about from a more remote perspective, even if, as I'd said, not exactly an Archimedean one, something that was less hot to the touch in that first effort to look at my family. So I wanted to kind of do do a look backwards at figures who had been inspirational to me and try to pick out of the work that they had done and the thinking that I had already done about their legacies, ideas and possibilities for reimagining life now. I wanted to sort of turn up the heat. I keep thinking of that word because so much felt kind of on fire or smoldering in those years surrounding Trump's election. I wanted to find a way of touring back and then moving forward. So the shape of the book tries to circle consistently through a number of different ideas in Freud while enlarging the circle, I guess, concentrically to include both figures who I've written about before, like Walter Benjamin and Stefan Zweig, and then particularly enlarging beyond them in the direction of the surrealists, partly because of this figure that I came upon in the course of my reading, Pierre Yoyot, who's not especially well known. He is a Black surrealist who died very young, but who wrote some amazing, a few amazing texts that have survived that seemed so pertinent to what we've been experiencing today, and was particularly concerned with what it meant essentially for rational progressive politics, to use our own language, to confront irrational mass politics of Nazism. He felt that the effort to tell workers, as the Communist Party that he was associated with did in the 1930s, basically that they would take care of their needs in the most literal, basic sense, was insufficient to galvanize real political passions. And he had this phrase that I cite that I find very poignant, of the misery of desire, which seemed to me to be something infecting a great swath of the American electorate in the years leading up to Trump, which cut across traditional right and left divisions and had to be addressed more effectively than the kind of basically neoliberal platform that Hillary Clinton was presenting in opposition to Trump's irrational fantasy politics. So surrealism, even in a very simplistic reductionist sense, seemed an important idea to get to, given how much that word and versions of it seemed to be part of the political discourse on one side or the other, as people attempted to categorize what was happening in America in recent years. So there's that, the number of times I saw that term of, this is surreal, this isn't real, this is like a dream, this is like a nightmare. It just was all over the place. So I because the surrealists are so indebted to Freud for their approaches to art, I tried to build through Freud ultimately to them, with Titian as a figure who comes in, of course not chronologically, but conceptually, to bridge notions of where philosophy and political analysis might be mapped onto a cultural artifact in ways that can allow us to propel our own imaginations forward to new possibilities. I wanted to, there are so many books that are being written, that are coming out, that have come out, let alone countless arguments about the phenomenon of the Trump presidency and efforts to counter it, that are either involved in one way or another with socioeconomic, political analyses. But I felt like there was maybe a purpose in trying to come at the question of what he represented and what opposing him and the phenomenon beyond his particular years in office represented specifically through aesthetics and culture and literature and philosophy. I think it might have been Masha Gessen. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but who early on in the Trump presidency said somewhere that one of the problems with the effect of this administration that had come into office was that it stopped people like herself from doing their work, which was the work of culture. And I think that's a very resonant idea. And I felt that we had to look at him partly through the cultural lens in order to get past that blockage. So the book tries to build, the structure of it reflects the structure of an intellectual journey through ideas that build momentum towards a very particular conclusion about the nature of our decision and the ideal of America that I still want to hold to even after these troubling years.
It's, of all odd coincidences, I was reading a Substack by a writer who went into a reflection he did on Ortega y Gasset in 2014 and how it holds up even more now, about how the conflict isn't left and right, and it's not the socioeconomic, it's up and down, that it's the experts and the elite versus people who resent the fact that somebody else is an expert at something. And reading the book and seeing, especially as I reached that yo-yo piece, that the line about the misery of desire really, I thank you for opening me up to that, echoed it in ways, and this is written in 1929 also. So, it's all of that era where they were starting to understand what was coming down the pike in ways that were oblique, maybe ways that no one could have envisioned, how absolutely horrific it would all become. But
I think that year there were so many astonishing things that happened then, and within a couple of years of that date, before Hitler's appointment as Chancellor of Germany, it was an astonishingly lucid time among those who had their eyes open at all. And the fact that 1929 saw the text that you're referencing, and it's this moment when civilization and its discontents is, at least in one iteration, appearing. And there's this critical moment between votes in Germany where the Nazis are about to score an enormous new body of voters. There was some kind of clarity that I hope that we can get ourselves to in time. It's of course one. It's not a fear. One historical truth is that these voices that are raised to alert people are not always heard by the auditors that one needs to bring about change. But I still think that even when the voices are drowned out by the clamor and by the hatred and by the violence, that they are lingering presences for the prospect of then picking up the shards of civilization after whatever conflagration proves inevitable, and allowing the process of rebuilding to commence. I think at least I know for myself that looking back at the writers of that period, that these moments of identification or of a chilling sense of recognition are helpful in orienting my own perspective on what's happening and ability to sort of think about the kinds of responses that I want to try to leave myself through my own acts as an individual. And I should mention, on bringing up that idea of as an individual, one point that I mentioned at the opening of the book is that I think that there have been a number of strong collective efforts, projects that have emerged in these moments of crises to try and counter the darker forces at work. And those are obviously critical for actually catalyzing real change. But we also need to find ways of responding in our individual lives, since we're not always part of a group. And I think art is often, can be at least for writers, is a solitary activity, but a solitary activity that is about connection. And I wanted to try and posit a scenario in which our individual actions, in addition, of course, to our collective responsibilities, might be able to have some kind of ripple effect in the larger society. It's why the part of the arc, as I get to the surrealists, is about this possibility of symbolic gestures and political symbolic gestures that have been made historically in works of art by individuals, by groups of individuals, small groups of individuals, that are designed to call attention to something, even when they are not themselves triggering change as such. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's just that ongoing frustration we all have in those lines, that in addition to the collective activity, what we do on our own, whether we're just making quixotic gestures or whether they all add up to something relatively meaningful. I mean, it's sort of the question of, from a more active political stance, you bring it up in the book, how could everything we had done, all the gains we had made, turn into the 2016 election? The way I sort of flip that sometimes is to think about what we'll say, more intellectual conservatives went through. Or we'll just say like an Andrew Sullivan, with everything, he was promoting and pushing for all these years, and getting gay marriage, accepted, and coming at everything from a conservative view. It culminates in the election of Donald Trump. And that sense of, wow, yeah, everything I was sort of pursuing as an intellectual political pursuit my entire career turned out to lead to this. Everybody from that side of things can always make excuses that it's an aberration, or it's, not exactly what it was supposed to be. But yeah, that sense of, I'll put it this way. The day after the election, I was as shell-shocked as everyone else in our world, maybe the whole world. And this project, the podcast, I was sitting like, what the hell am I doing? Why am I spending my nights and weekends building some little cultural outpost when this is, the bigger, the bigger picture of what actually happens? And there was despair, of course. And, it was, I guess that maybe just that first day, I was walking around the block with the dog, and I remembered the very end of Invisible Cities by Calvino, the final paragraph about, if everything is tending towards inferno, what the hell are you supposed to do, as it were? Mm-hmm. And he has that line about, find the things that are not inferno and, give them space and help them grow. I never know if that's enough. I mean,
well, I certainly find that very resonant, and absolutely in these last years have only made me feel more strongly than ever that something like your podcast project is all the more important. They are acts of rebuilding, even when something isn't already entirely destroyed. They're counter moves, and I think that idea of a culmination in something like the election, that's of course a vein of thinking that we have to avoid, that teleological perspective. Yeah. It's always a trap. And another reason that I felt Freud was so critical to re-invoke at this moment is that he so much of his project seems to me about refuting the idea that we ever transcend in some definitive way our baser selves, our more wicked, bestial aspects. Those are always there, and they're always something that we have to navigate. So, that isn't, to me, that isn't a pessimistic perspective. It's more saying that there isn't any beyond that we need to get to, and suddenly all of the problems that we are plagued by at this moment are going to be solved, but that we can learn to integrate our different aspects in more and less humane, imaginatively fruitful ways, and that our responsibility is to I talk at one point about Emerson's essay in which he has this idea of learning to live with our polarities, and that seems to me really important. As individuals, we have to accept this rich contradictory state of our psyches, and as societies, we have to accept that there are elements in our society that will never effectively integrate and have to be legally prevented from sabotaging all efforts to make civilization advance. I think that the polarities of an individual psyche are not the same kind of they're not the same as the dynamic tensions within a society, where they're in the latter. I think they're forces that are clearly entirely pernicious, and I would never be someone who made the case that, well, one aspect of the Trump presidency is at least he brought all this horrible stuff of American identity out into the open. I mean, I think that's been in itself terrible. And, it's another reason that I think the phenomenon of his presidency, really, the importance of it can't be overstated, because although it's certainly true that America had all of these sides to itself, swirling around this underside of supremacist, apocalyptic capitalism, etc. trends, it's still different when there's no lid on it whatsoever, when it's openly paraded as, in fact, some form of virtue to bear all this and make it dominate the cultural and political spheres.
But as Jews, with our distinct family histories, I don't want to say we knew it all along, but we sort of knew it was there, right? I mean, I'm first generation American. I came over, my family came over in 1965, but you have documented your family's history on that side of things, especially. There's always that sense that I don't want to say rootless, but that we're always about to be torn up from our roots.
100%. And, I can never.
Not that this is something worse about America overall. I mean, we'd say this about any country in the world, pretty much. But
right. I mean, I was just going to say one of the things that I don't linger on in talking about my family's history in this Zweig book is that my father doesn't. He has one or two memories of anti-Semitism actively affecting him as a child in Austria, but he was beaten up, as he remembers it, almost daily in America as a Jew, beaten up by Irish Catholics in Boston, who was using explicitly anti-Semitic discourse and oppressing him. So it's not that these racist or racist and just monolithic ways of thinking aren't definitely always part of America. Of course they've been here and they've oppressed and continue to oppress different minority groups. But I don't believe that it's the same phenomenon when you have the commander-in-chief more or less spouting the worst kind of hate speech as the voice of, in some way, the voice of the country. I think it's still worse, and and it's harder to recover from. And the fact that since the presidency happened, you still find the GOP so enthralled to him is incredibly sobering. Even if he does not find it possible to become reelected for all sorts of reasons, and even if the GOP is defeated, the fact that tens of millions of people in the country are still part of the cultically obsessed with him in some way, seeing him as a messianic figure, it's too many people. And it's a problem even if the Republicans are routed in the next election, as could happen, and I certainly hope will happen. It's not a good situation when you have one of the two major parties entirely throws to that, right?
So what do you miss about America that you didn't expect to miss, knowing that your shortly after your arrival and move, the pandemic begins in 2020, and that makes traveling even more difficult. But what did you miss?
Well, the obvious, and
besides family,
besides family and loved ones, which of course are what I miss most. I lived in Jerusalem for just shy of 10 years. And I remember at that point when I was there raising a family, I didn't have the money to come home very often, come home to America. And I used the word home just automatically without thinking just then. But I remember there was always this sense of returning to such an ease that went beyond economy, just an abundance, a world of natural and manufactured plenty. And it's still the case. I mean, England is in the scheme of things, a wealthy country, obviously, but there's not everything in Europe is more constricted, and the limits are much more in your face all the time. Now, I think that America, between climate change and this idea that democracy is hanging on in a semi-nominal way at this point, I think America is looking at limits in a manner that it never has had to do before, and that this involves will necessitate a deep reimagining of what American identity is, because I think it's been so bound up with a sense of boundless amplitude, right? And I don't know what the country becomes if that has to be surrendered in light of both meteorological and political changes. But I miss a sense of freedom of movement in a very sensorial way. What it's like to just pass between all these astonishing cities and landscapes that the country is blessed to include is a unique thing, and something of that spatial ideational freedom and enormity of national being is something that I miss tremendously, and you can't reconstitute it in some artificial way. There is a hopefulness. I mentioned this at the beginning of our conversation, but a hopefulness built into American character, and it can easily divert into a sort of Scarface ambition, kind of just for more and more profit. But it doesn't always. Sometimes that American hope really is hope for an embracing, humanistically embracing sublimation of our current paradigm, and that's a wonderful thing. And there is something about the country that conduces to that hopefulness that I'll always long for. And I don't know if I should give away the end of the book. Maybe I won't, but it speaks exactly to the question that you've just raised.
Yeah. It's when you mentioned that go-go nature in America, one of the things that struck me about the book was your discussions of work and working as a writer and working in, quote unquote professional writing, and how most writers tend to elide that stuff. They either pretend, the money's coming from somewhere else, or just kind of dash off what office and work life is like in, a sentence or two. Whereas it does seem to, it seems to weigh on you both in terms of, what that work entails on a day-to-day basis, but also what it means to be implicated in the larger nature of work and capital, especially in New York City as we know it.
I'm very glad you brought that up. Did I cut you off? Were you going to?
No, I was just going to cite the hidden shadow that lurks over that entire notion then, which is Bartleby and the question of Melville's influence and contrasting him with Whitman, which would take me on a whole other rant. So why don't you talk instead?
Well, I'm glad you raised it, because it was very important to me to look as squarely as I could at the compromises that I had ended up making to support my family and live ostensibly as an artist in New York City. I tried for a long time to get work of a more honorable nature, but I had 3 small children, and I ended up working for a publicist, and I really can't defend any of it except that I had made the decision that I was going to be in New York, and that was the place of employment that ultimately hired me. But I think there is a way in which the whole structure of New York, obviously, is geared towards such inconceivable, on a global level, scales of financial affluence, that one of the problems in the city now is that the idea of being kind of an eccentric, hand-to-mouth artist of any sort is almost inconceivable. I'm sure that there are group living situations that are happening, and there are exceptions, but it's not a place that any young artist would advisedly go to who doesn't have a private stream of income. And what was the remark that Patti Smith made some years ago about basically kids, New York is closed, because she just didn't see it possible anymore to live the kind of revolutionary life that she wanted to position as part and parcel of being a true artist. I know that a number of my friends who are not fortunate to be well remunerated authors or painters have had to make similar decisions. And I think if we don't look at them, we can't understand how the phenomenon of the last presidency was possible. We have to face up to what we've done to earn money, and whether it's meaningless, as was mostly the case in my work, or is directly injurious of some population or aspect of the planet, or is injurious because it's vacuous. The minute that we're supporting it by our labor, we're part of the problem. And the whole book, and I've now actually written a second book, which focuses on the question of art in times of calamity. It grew out of a series of conversations that I had with one of my sons, who was a paramedic during the pandemic and is himself an artist. And we spoke about the question of what art can and cannot do in times of crisis. And these conversations sort of grow into a larger meditation on this theme historically. But although the 2 books are books in conversation and books that are, as you said at the beginning of this, memoiristic, I'm only interested in writing about myself as a critique of choices I've made, and here and there as, I hope, a presentation of windows onto other ways of being. I try to use my story as, if not representative, because it's idiosyncratic, as filled with lots of equivocation and fear and bad choices, in the interest of casting into relief the ways that we're all right now trapped in a series of structural impossibilities, largely, as I argue, have come to believe only more and more, because of the ways that we've let capitalism evolve as apocalyptically as we have. I think that I believe strongly that if humanity survives another 50, 100 years, that people will look back at what an individual could make in America in this period of history, even post all of the recent traumas, with the kind of aghast disbelief that we look back on massive institutional crimes like colonialism. It's inconceivable that with tens, hundreds of millions of people suffering basic food instability, that we allow the sorts of salaries that drive the tech industry and finance and other worlds as well. It's a grave historical wrong. And because of the demands of living day to day, even a middle class life in New York demands such amounts of money that people end up earning those kinds of salaries. We have to look at what we've structured that makes those forms of work remunerated in the ways that they are, and how can we both redistribute wealth more effectively. And for me, as a cultural worker, what I'd like to say is to, along with redistributing wealth, to more broadly disseminate the valuations of the sorts of culture that have produced the great achievements of civilization throughout history, not just in the United States, but worldwide.
So where do you stand on the Warburg quote? You include several in the book, but that the conscious creation of distance between the self and the external world may be called the fundamental act of civilization.
Well,
is that in terms of art making, or our day-to-day function, our ability to separate and interact?
Right. I think part of the reason that quote was important here was I'm glad you raised the question now, because it exactly speaks to why I would indulge in an exercise of a memoristic nature, if nothing else. I was trying to get and to work with a distance that I felt should be just enough to allow me to understand more of what I'd done without losing the visceral immediacy that I'd experienced in making the specific choices that led to our leaving America. I think Warburg's importance in that vein of his thought now might be considered in light of phenomena like Twitter and like all of the immediately reactive platforms and venues that we are addicted to so intensely. It's an argument for reflection, I believe, and I think that, and I'm certainly far from the only person arguing this, but that one of the really poisonous aspects of this moment is this felt responsibility to immediately respond all the time, which simply can't allow for the kinds of thought and the sorts of visionary openings that we are so desperately in need of to manifest themselves.
One of the interesting, perspective setting moments in the book, I think you're citing Freud, although it might be someone else who, even in the 20s and 30s, with with phones, with telegraphs, etc., communication was getting too fast.
Mm.
And, it was all going to be too much. And yet there's not even a conception of what we would currently be facing. And I'm sure 20 years from now, they'll be laughing at how we thought Twitter was too much for people.
Well, I mean, I remember, I don't think I read about it in this work, but there's an essay that really struck me from 1926 by Stefan Zweig, who wrote about the monotonization of the world. And he was attributing it to the wireless and the ability to promulgate globally fashions in dance, in clothing, in thought, in taste, so that you never had a chance for any kind of local culture to emerge. And he also felt, and obviously we chuckle at this idea being so pressing in the 20s, given what we're dealing with now, but he worried that the wireless communication of news meant that you could never escape a sense of being enmeshed in one disaster or another, even if there was nothing that you could do about them. So you couldn't attain to that distance that might allow you to actually act productively in response to any of the crises, because you were too enveloped in a flood here, a fire there, a war there, a famine there. And we now are unable, obviously, to assimilate the kind of cataclysmic crush of bad news with which we're confronted every time that we tap into our feeds. And we have to find ways of gaining a distance that is only more compassionate and empathetic than that sort of immersive sensorium of trauma and tragedy.
One of the things that struck me, and this is a complete aside, but it was after Queen Elizabeth's death, the race to make the cleverest quip on Twitter about it. Mm. I was just sitting there, no one's going to remember who you are 5 minutes after you're dead. But, I see why that's a motivating factor to try to come up with some way of creating ridicule about somebody else who had this, like it or not, world historical position in life.
I think that's a really good thing to bring up. And I mean, don't we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing on a medium that foregrounds and rewards that practice? What are we doing? The Queen, I mean,
whatever you think of what her significance was.
Whatever you feel. And there's one writer on the left here who just said something very simple, an anti-colonialist writer who said, essentially, there was no one else here in this country, the UK, in a position of power, who was at least trying to think about ways of bringing about some kind of unity in the fracturing population. But regardless of what you think of her, to think that the key is a competitive sneering and snarking, I mean, it's not going to bring about anything politically good.
And it's, at first I was just getting irritated, and then I realized it's because these people know their own lives are not noteworthy, that all of them will vanish, that I imagine, and it probably ties back to our Freud Eros and Thanatos issue, the fact that they know their own world will vanish means they need to tear down whatever is around them, which I guess gets us back to Trump, Bannon, and everybody else in terms of that larger, tearing down of institutions. Boy, we got to that step in a big hurry. I should probably cut back and
I saw, I mean, there's so much emphasis now in the progressive world on bringing awareness and knowledge, and of course it's great. But I did see this quote from George Eliot recently from Daniel Deronda, where she says more or less, people are always talking about the power of knowledge, but they're not paying enough attention to the power of ignorance, which can tear down in an hour what knowledge builds up in a generation or a century. And That's again a paraphrase, but I think we're seeing a moment when the power of ignorance has to give us pause about whether the solution is entirely lies in making something conscious. It's one of the reasons that I'm trying to argue for recuperation of radical unconscious politics in the service of humane ideals.
And we really haven't explored the unconscious and Freud aspects of the book itself, which could take another 2 hours, which if we were doing this in person, I guarantee we would end up doing. But yeah, it's, the book continually raises the question for me, is civilization doomed? Is civilization as a concept doomed based on your reading and approaches to civilization and its discontents and where we are right now and what your own reactions to it have been?
We're clearly teetering on some kind of precipice. And I of course, one can point to endless moments of teetering in the past. But I do think that the convergence of pressures now may be different. This is something I spoke about with my father, who passed away this last summer. And in one of our last conversations, I was asking him, it was a day of particularly bleak news of different sorts, and I was asking him how he thought about this time relative to his experience of Europe, Central Europe in the 1930s, and then his early experience in the United States in the 1940s. And he said exactly that the mix of environmental, global, local, and national crises seemed to him an inflammatory and poisonous brew of a nature that may even have been different in his own youth.
It puts me in mind, I'm thinking about our conversation on the Impossible Exile, or the Stefan Zweig book, and Zweig's own reaction in 1942 to finally end it, knowing that the world that he knew was never coming back, even if the Allies won, which started to seem likely. Which is to say, I'm glad you didn't include Petropolis in the potential destinations when you were going over places you guys could flee to. But, that sense, thank you, that sense of not just what the despair can be, but the knowing how far the despair can go from these object examples, making sure you didn't descend too far, I guess, didn't let the despair take hold too deeply.
Well, I think that Petropolis, which is where, for those who don't know, where Stefan Zweig ended up committing suicide with his 27 years younger second wife, Lotte. Petropolis is, of course, in my mind, not as a personal
symbolically,
but as a warning of the degree of calamity that we are grappling with, and I think that you are seeing in this mental health crisis that is unfolding among young people, even when it doesn't always take the form of suicidal ideation. There is something on both sides of the Atlantic that is happening in terms of terrible anxiety and fears that, however removed these mental problems may be explicitly from the situation that the world is in today, obviously, I believe, are partly a response to more existential crises than whatever is immediately affecting them. Kids know, and kids, I certainly know from my own children, are more prone to nihilism than than my generation was. And I wanted, with this book, I want in my life to refuse to foreclose the possibility of some kind of salvational outcome to things. I don't think that the story is finished. And I quote in this book, as I quoted in the Sholem book, a line from Gershom Scholem that I really believe is true, where he talks about there being moments in history that he described as history's plastic hours, when many, many different elements of society and of the political structures that we live amidst are in motion and in some more fluid, molten state. And on the one hand, those moments come about at times of danger, but they're also moments of hope, because they're moments in which, when you move, he said, things happen. And I completely believe that we're living in one of history's plastic hours right now, and there are unforeseen possibilities that may come to pass, not disastrously, not negatively. One of the aspects of this book that we didn't talk about is I try to make a case for recuperating the unknown as a space of possibility, not just a space of fear. I think what we know right now looks very, very bad, what we know consciously. But in the unknown, which has some kind of familial romance with the unconscious, in the unknown, there are things that may emerge and prove to change our perspective and change our world in ways that will allow us to reach some better state and some more embracingly just and well nourished social reality than what we can see from right here.
I don't want to say the book is inspiring, but it does. It's not the pessimistic slog. If I've been implying that in any way, it really, especially the more you dive into Freud as the central figure and what it was like to shift to an understanding of or to try to make an understanding of the unconscious and what comes up from below. It's you succeeded in that respect, in showing that there's more than we see and potentially more that can I would say change the world.
Yeah, there's more than we can see, and thank God for that. We know, if nothing else, that we don't know in any sort of conclusive, consummate way what's happening right now. And that's a space in which all the dark conspiratorial theories can fester and incubate, but it's also the reason that we shouldn't give up.
I would say it's a good point to leave off on, but I do have two last questions for you.
Sure.
First, what are you reading?
Well, I'm always reading too many books at once. But right now I'm reading both two of the main books I'm reading. I am rereading George Eliot's Daniel Deronda, and then I'm reading for the first time a recent New York Review of Books republication of a Victor Serge novel about the fall of France called Last Times. But I'm reading right now also lots and lots of art history for a new project that I'm just beginning to get off the ground. And so that's fun, and also I hope a place where I'll be able to turn away from some of the
Well, just say fun. Fun is something you need at this point in your.
I need a bit of, and I think frankly that most of us right now need a bit of delight and pleasure and wonder. We've had deficits of these, so I'm turning to art, which was critical to both of the last things I've written, but in a slightly different, from a slightly different vantage point that I hope will explore further the ways that we can find some kind of redemptive experience with not just the experience of art, but with the experience of pursuing artistic understanding and truths.
I've prattled about it on the show for the last year and a half, but my own just taking up drawing at the age of 50 and learning how to see has changed everything. It's been one of those, this is what I missed for half a century. Okay, you actually engage the world in a completely different way. That's oops, so I look forward to
stores to do something like that, doesn't it? And that's
well, the nice thing was there were absolutely no expectations. A 50-year-old guy starting to draw for the first time, no one is going to think, well, Gil, that's not good enough. They're just going to say, well, okay, just you keep doing your thing there, and maybe I'll be able to recognize that tree eventually. But it worked. But still, it was something I could do because it didn't involve the set of pressures and expectations that come from verbal work that I'm accustomed to. But my other big question, and I do plan on reading your subsequent books, as I've read your last couple, and hope to get you on again to talk about those.
Thanks.
Toughest thing to explain to British people about America since you've moved there, is it the guns or is it the healthcare?
Oh, I think it's the healthcare.
Or is there a third thing?
I think it's healthcare. I think that just even I have a very good friend here, a lovely person who is the head of a medical practice, herself a GP, and she's the head of a practice that works primarily with a very disadvantaged population. And when she hears the stories about medical bills in America, she simply can't believe it to this day, although this is her profession, is to work in healthcare. And she's a worldly person. She knows she's been to America and she's been to many different places, but there's something about that seems so unbelievably barbaric and just cruel. So guns, I mean, I think
the gun thing is weird, but I guess you can extrapolate, a stereotype about Americans and just, well, of course they're going to walk around like Yosemite Sam, and
I think maybe that's true. That maybe because there's so many pop cultural reference points for thinking about America and guns, it's different than the much less glamour aligned world of healthcare.
But yeah, no, I was at visiting one of my pharmaceutical manufacturing clients on Wednesday, and it was a whole bunch of consultants and other guys who manufacture for drug companies like this one does. And somehow the debate or conversation we were getting into was about drug pricing, which none of us are involved in. We just make drugs for the drug companies, the guys I represent. Mm-hmm. But even there, like, they were looking to me as though I had insight about the reimbursement process and all this. I'm like, guys, I know nothing. Like, you guys actually run businesses and therefore have to handle your employees' insurance. Any of you have more practical experience than I do. I'm just, the lobbyist and the guy who's paying for his own health care. But yeah, it's one of those that, I had wondered if that's,
I mean, even though we've been here 4 years, I can't really believe it when I go to my GP or to a specialist and I don't even have to sign my name. It's like that feeling in a dream if one walks out of the house without being fully dressed. It's like, do I really just leave now? I mean,
surely I'm supposed to give them something. Yeah.
You give your name and that's it. And it is, with all that is correct, that's written about the pressure that the NHS is under. And I don't in any way mean to mitigate or minimize that. It's still miraculous that whatever your socioeconomic status is, you can count on being able to, in most cases, outside of the worst moments of the pandemic and the fallout of that, which continues to haunt the effort, you can count on being cared for in a basic way. Maybe not count on now. I'm feeling myself say things that too many people have had negative experiences recently for me to be able to really back up. But certainly compared to the United States, it seems like a blessing.
If I make it to UK, which I'm debating doing in November, I will, I A, hope not to get injured. B, hope you and I can meet up in person and continue the conversation a little.
I'll look forward to that.
George, thanks so much for coming on. It's great talking to you. I'm looking forward to in person again sometime. And that was George Prochnik. His new memoir, I Dream with Open Eyes, is out now from Counterpoint. It is, as I hope we got across, a really thoughtful exploration of home, exile, roots, and 20th and 21st century history. It's a great counterpoint to Rebecca Mead's recent memoir, Homeland, and a great compliment to them. I'm really interested in seeing the next piece that George alluded to in our conversation, because he's published some bits and pieces that seem to be feeding into it. So we'll see where that goes and when he and I get to sit down and talk again. Now, he doesn't have a website, and while he has Twitter and Instagram feeds, he does not seem to be active on either one of those. So I guess that means you're just going to have to go back and listen to my previous conversations with George and check out his previous books, along with I Dream with Open Eyes, to get a better idea about who George Prochnik is. Now, you can support this podcast by telling other people about it. Tell them there is this show that comes out every week with really fascinating conversations with interesting people. And you can also help the show out by telling me what you like and don't like about it, who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by sending me a postcard. I love postcards, letter, email, or by leaving me a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you go longer than that and then get cut off, just call back in and leave the rest of your message. And let me know if it would be okay to use your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something neat that would be great to share with the listeners, but I would never do that without getting the speaker's approval. Now, if you've got money to spare or other resources, don't give it to me. I'm doing just fine with the day job, and my expenses are really minimal for the podcast. So I hope you'll support individuals or institutions in need. And you can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Topatogo, Crowdfunder, and other crowdfunding platforms. And a lot of people need help with medical bills or rent or artistic projects are trying to get off the ground or other stuff. So I hope you'll help people. If you want to help an institution instead, I give to my local food bank, the Poor People's Campaign. I make targeted election funds. There are other things you can do, freedom funds, women's choice, Planned Parenthood, and abortion funds. There are a lot of things you can do to try to help build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.